Hi, and welcome back to Like Maria. Today I'm going to talk to you about another poem of the decade. So this will be useful for Edixell Pearson Poems of the Decade. And I'm going to talk to you about Seamus Heaney's Out of the Bag. So please give us a follow and a like if you enjoy this lecture. So, to begin with, Seamus Heaney, Out of the Bag. I think you should study this poem with a view to looking at this as an autobiographical description and exploration of Heaney's poetic journey. And he has taken the birthing process and the reflection on different moments in his life that link to changes in his life in order to follow the way his journey towards becoming an internationally renowned poet has developed. First off, I think it's really useful to break down this poem into 4 sections. Number 1, memories of Dr Kerlin's visit. Number 2, the adult memories that he has of being part of the academic world, reading, going to Greece and the temple of Epidaurus, and going to Lourdes as a younger man and having this experience. Then very carefully zooming in on a particular personal experience of feeling faint, and then returning to the start of the poem where he's in his mum's room watching the new child and the mum and going back into that myth of the idea of coming out of the bag. So make sure you track those sections through the poem. So returning to this idea of his poetic journey, I want to talk first of all about the eponymous bag, about the title. So here we have this bag that the doctor brings. The first line, very assertive, blunt and simple. All of us came in Dr Kerlin's bag. A declarative statement. It's the statement that every child has been told in that culture, in that locality, to not have to explain the complexity of the birthing process and the creation process. And Heaney is taking that myth that was delivered to children and exploring the imagery of the bag and the imagery of creation. He describes the bag as having a trap-sprung mouth, gaping wide. It's delivering up its goods, it's ready. Now I think here, really importantly, is the imagery of the mouth gaping wide, because as well as this being a kind of substitute metaphor for the womb and what comes out of it and how science helps, the doctor helps the birthing process and he brings the bag and this mythological idea surrounding the bag, it's also focused particularly on its mouth, and the mouth of course is where words come from, and this is where really Heaney is reflecting the poet in him was born. The poet in him was born, of course, quite physically from his mother, but he's saying his inspiration comes from his windows on the world. His window on the world here is Dr Kerlin. He sees these peepholes that he can now see through the eyes of Dr Kerlin. Dr Kerlin was the first person from the outside world. He's from a different class, he's from a different culture, he's from the scientific world, and Heaney as a young boy marvels at this. And even as a young boy, he starts his poetry very simply in childish language to begin with. He has these nosy, rosy, big soft hands. Even with that assonance and rhyme there, he's beginning to formulate, in very simple childish language, the language of poetry. But note, when he describes the doctor, he's already there with his Greek, the Hyperborean, beyond the north wind blue. The eyes aren't just simply blue. Now, of course, this is Heaney, the older poet, mixing the language of the young boy and the perceptions of the young boy with the more sophistication in his description. He does this again when he has that very simple line, quite crude in its delivery. A toe, a foot and shin, an arm, a cock. But then he reworks this, and you can see the poet working here, a bit like the rosebud in his buttonhole. So he turns something quite visceral and shocking maybe into something quite beautiful and uses that simile. These are the tools of the poet that are being explored in this first section. Another part of this which makes me really think that this is about him reflecting on his journey is the reference to incubation. He talks about incubation, the site of incubation, when he talks about these temples. And later on, he revisits that imagery in the very last section. He talks about where he is standing, incubating for real. And I think this is him thinking about those thoughts that are developing in him as a young man, and how he yearns to go out into the world, to have experience, to read poetry, to mix with other poets and academics and study literature. And these ideas are incubating in him as a young boy. They're somehow working away in his mind. And then, of course, he has this link with the poetic journey to becoming a healer. Now, his inspiration for being a poet in some ways comes from this scene of creation and the scientific man, Dr Kerlin, visiting. And he sees poetry, I really feel here, Heaney, as some kind of healing. The first reference to this is the realisation that the whole place was a sanatorium, that this spiritual ritual that he encounters in places like Epidaurus, later on in the poem in Lourdes, is associated with healing. He talks of the bits of grass I pulled and posted off, to one going into chemotherapy and one who had come through. And he talks about Lourdes, a place traditionally linked with healing. So all of these give the sense that his poetic journey is somehow intertwined with this medical profession, this scientific profession of healing, and that his words and his poetry, perhaps healing himself, perhaps healing his community and his readers. Now, of course, this is nothing new. We get Keats talking a great deal about this. If you look at, for example, his sonnet On the Sea, you will see this romantic idea of nature healing, but also poetry and the words creating imagery and creating a space in which people are allowed to heal. So, talking about incubation, talking about the mixture of birthing imagery and becoming a poet, and then talking about this notion of healing. I also want to look quite closely at that section where he lies down on the ground. So in Lourdes, in section 2, he kind of has a fainting moment. And then he talks about, and he mixes his imagery with the big soapy hands of Dr Kerlin, but also, I myself came too, blinded with sweat, blinking and shaky in the windless light. And here he's mixing that imagery of the birthing of a child with him having this experience in Lourdes where he fainted and then came to. And this again is birthing imagery. And for me, this is very much associated with his kind of epiphany and perhaps a sort of apotheosis, a change, a godlike change almost that comes in him. We get that with, in Keats, for example, with Hyperion and Apollo, the birthing of the poet, the suggestion that there was a change from one being to another to becoming a poet. And here we get this idea very much with Heaney that he has undergone a change and he has now come through and he is in the light of the possibilities of poetry and becoming a poet. He talks again about wanting nothing more than to lie down and be visited in the very eye of day by Hygeia. So he is craving the muse here. He is talking about how he's craving the muse, how he wants space and a place to write. And he's describing these places that gave him that ability, the birth room, the temples he visited, the conversations with the poeta doctors Peter Levy or Robert Graves, for example. So he's describing the space and the journey which led him to be able finally to create the poem. I think all this is really important reflection for Heaney about his journey because he often looks back into his domestic setting, the innocence, the naivety of growing up as a boy in Ireland and not experiencing high culture, as it were, and then enveloping himself, surrounding himself with culture and experience, and how this grows a person, it grows a person's identity and grows a poet. One more thing I'd like to mention before we finish with this poem is its very gentle, regular rhythm. Much of it is in a loose iambic pentameter, and it's in these regular stanzas. And I think this helps really bring a natural feeling to Heaney's voice in the saying of it, and in his journey we can accompany him because there isn't too much forced poeticness, if you like. It seems to come very, very naturally to him. Okay, I'm going to leave it there. I hope you enjoyed. Please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time for more Poems of the Decade.